A number of years ago, I'm teaching Asian American Studies, Introduction to Asian American Studies. That's Asian Am 101. It's in 1121 Humanities, and if you've ever been there, 1121 is kind of like a big small classroom or a small big classroom. So I'm there teaching that spring, and I noticed off to the side, to my right, in a corner, I see a student. And this student seems, especially at times, angry, I thought, or engaged for sure, or agitated. And I'm saying to myself, well, at least this one's awake. So I was grateful for that. When I finished teaching that 101 on that Monday, Wednesday schedule, I would go to a room nearby to decompress, because I had to decompress. And then that student, whom I thought was agitated or interested or somehow angry, he saw me. And he entered the class and he said, oh, hello, my name is Alex Hopp, and I am especially interested in Asian American Studies. And so for me, that was the high point of the semester. That was the high point of the semester, to have someone say they're especially interested in the introduction to Asian American Studies. So that being the high point, I learned in the subsequent years that there's so much more to expect from Alex Hopp than just showing up in a room where I happen to be. I had the pleasure of serving on his master's committee, where I learned so much about the possessive investment of whiteness, possessive investment in whiteness, and how mainstream Wisconsin communities interpret and misinterpret, misconstrue their Hmong American neighbors through the possessive investment in whiteness. Alex, I see on a daily basis on the third floor of Ingram Hall, where he's teaching many courses for the Asian American Studies program, even as he is pursuing his doctorate from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities in history. As we've come to know from Alex, he is always interested in pushing the edges of interpretation and the edges of historiography. And we're going to hear that today, and I'm going to take a big risk, because I'm not Hmong, but I'm now going to mispronounce a Hmong word. We are now going to hear about, I'm not going to try. We are now going to hear about how Hmong American historiography and Hmong diasporic historiography can be a lens for reinterpreting Southeast Asian history and Southeast Asian studies. And so may I present Alex Hopp.
Well, that was an incredibly generous introduction, and I think it is really good to be back. I also did my master's degree here in the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, and there is something I think uniquely intimidating about looking out at the room and seeing my entire committee. Because when I defended my master's, I did so during the pandemic with the benefit of a computer screen between us. They don't know this, but I was actually, I wore the same suit top, but I actually had shorts on during my defense. It's a little different today to be in front of you all, and I also see, several of the professors I am incredibly indebted to for my time here, several of, community members who really pushed me to think through this work. So what I want to do today is, really less of a traditional lecture, because what I'm trying to present is how I am thinking through my research, how I'm structuring the history I'm trying to write in my dissertation. And it's a history that is, I think, inherently diasporic in that it focuses on the Hmong diaspora, but really what I'm interested in today is to look at what I would call two different poles, right? And that is the Hmong diaspora in Southeast Asia and the Hmong diaspora in the United States. And so really I think the question I'm interested in having us discuss is this idea of empire, right? And the problem of empire, as I would put it, in both history as a field, but also I think within Southeast Asian studies as a field. And so taking those two together, we get the Southeast Asian history I would kind of like to interrogate today. And so I think the basis of my argument, the underlying thing that I'm trying to say here is that the experiences of the Hmong diaspora and the way that they've had to navigate between empire, through statelessness, is in and of itself inherently subversive. It inherently contradicts the way that empire thinks, We can say it fights back against the epistemological violence of empire, And so using that as a foundation, I want to come and try and think through, how we might better conduct history that is more faithful to the experiences of the people that we investigate, And so I have to start, also with the confession, and that is that I am a a traitor of sorts, as Dr. Mike would probably put it, in that I did my master's in Southeast Asian Studies, and the entire time he was trying to convince me to do more and more and more about Southeast Asia, which makes sense, it was a Southeast Asian Studies program. But when I arrived in Minnesota, I found I had the opposite problem. I was classified as an Americanist, as a US historian. And I found myself looking more and more for opportunities to talk about Southeast Asia, right? The grass is always greener on the other side, in my experience. And so I think the reason that diaspora for me represents such an important intervention is because it bridges the two. And it does it seamlessly. And in doing so, right, I think it does something significant for how we write an anti-imperial historiography. So, to talk through the idea of Southeast Asian studies and Southeast Asian history, I want to go back to ancient history, 1961. And my dad, right, to give you an idea of how old this is, I am closer to being born, right, from this date. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. It is closer from the time where this lecture was given to the day I was born than from the day I was born was till today. Right? My father, who I would consider to be an old man, who will probably watch this on YouTube and fall asleep in his chair at about 6 p.m. in my house, he was born only 2 years before. So this is, to me, right, an example of the foundations of a field that I only encountered much, much later. And so this is the first International Conference of Southeast Asian Historians, right? And there's a speech that's given on the possibility of an autonomous history of modern Southeast Asia. And I want to use this as a starting point, I think, because oftentimes when we think about the foundations of area studies, and the foundations of something like Southeast Asian studies as a field in the academy, we are forced to confront a colonial past. I think at this point, right, that's not even a controversial statement. We understand the connections between empire and area studies and how historiography can be a foundational tool in that epistemic violence of empire. But I think what this speech gives us, right, what this address gives us, is an insight into how past generations attempted to solve this problem. And I think what we see is by using Qhuab Ke's method, right, by looking at the epistemology of the Hmong Diaspora, we find a way to advance these ideas even further. So what are the actual obstacles that are identified in this idea, right? Well, the obstacles, right, that Smail is identifying when he gives this speech are related in some ways to this older concept of Orientalism, right? He says that scholars in the field see a fundamental difference between Asia and the United States, or Asia and the West, right? And so we look and he breaks it down further in his talk, right? He says first, there's a systemic moral bias in the form of one-sided value judgments, right? The historians who are writing about Southeast Asian history are doing so in an attempt to make a moral argument, right? And that moral argument, it only flows one way. It paints Southeast Asia as backwards, or as primitive, or as morally bankrupt, right? The worst sort of vestiges of imperial historiography. Secondly, he says another major issue of Southeast Asian historiography is an inability to see Asia in the foreground. That even if you are giving, right, a lecture or you are doing a historical investigation that is focused in Southeast Asia and is ostensibly about Southeast Asians, the West ends up being the primary focus. And he's writing this, right, at a time where literal empire, right, where high colonialism is much, much more recent. And so he says, when he looks at all of the historiography of the field, I see a field that is writing about itself, that is writing about the West, using Southeast Asia, right, as a setting. And in doing so, right, I think he is actually parodying what Edward Said would come to give as, one of the major conclusions in his post-colonial critique of Orientalism, right, where he says, it acts almost like a mirror. We learn little about Asia, but much about the West. And then finally, and this I think is most important for the argument I want to make today, he makes the argument that one of the major issues is one of methods. He says that when they're looking for the categories through which to understand history, through which to classify history, through which to bound their investigations of the past, they use Western categories. And they swap between these categories and they think they're doing something radical or something revolutionary, but really they're just swapping out one imposed structure for another. They are failing to actually capture the complexity of Southeast Asian history. And so for me, right, thinking about this, I would include these to be both temporal and geographic boundaries. And I think as a historian, right, for those of you who are historians, we understand that temporal and geographic boundaries are still the foundations of our field. If I'm supposed to present what I do as my topic, right, I don't just talk about where I study, I talk about when I study, right? So today we see this lingering still. And I think, right, he moves on in this speech and he goes on to talk about the goal of autonomy. And for me, right, this is where we have to do a little bit of a work of translation. Because autonomy is not necessarily a concept that I see used today, right? We might talk about autonomy in specific contexts, but as an ideological concept, right, as an epistemological foundation of a historical project, I don't see it very often. So what does he mean by autonomy? Well, he specifies and he says that the autonomy he's talking about is not just visible political and economic power, right? But an ever-present agency. And it's often rendered invisible. He says it doesn't show up in our histories. We can't see it, right? Because of all of these constraints, we fail to see where this autonomy exists. And I think what's important here, right, is although he doesn't really say this as such, he's not just talking about agency. When you go and you read his actual speech, he's also talking about things like resilience and things like survivance, right? For those of us who are unfamiliar with the term, survivance is taken from indigenous studies. It's an idea that gets at, right, how indigenous folks in the United States and in other areas not just survive but thrive, right? Cultivate new cultures and new life, even in conditions of slow death and empire. And so really, right, when we see this call for an autonomous history of Southeast Asia, what I see is a very similar initiative to what, in my mind, is the highest calling of history today, which is a history that celebrates not just agency, right, but resilience and survivance, a history and a historiography that can contribute to moving us away from empire. So how do we arrive at this autonomous history? Well, luckily, he doesn't leave us hanging, right? He gives us some answers. He says, first, we have to move away from this false binary of East versus West, Europe versus Asia, right? And I recently had an opportunity to teach a course on Southeast Asian history, just an intro to Southeast Asia class for the University of Minnesota. And I found the binary that was most vexing to me, that I got the most questions about, was this idea of mainland versus island Southeast Asia, right? And it's not the same binary as East versus West, but I think it does go to show that we like binaries, that they do something for us. They help structure the way that we understand the world around us. And so he says we have to move away from that, right? Next, he says we have to emphasize what he calls internal histories by recentering the agency of Southeast Asians themselves. And this is where really, right, we're getting at that context of where he is speaking, when he is speaking. Because he looks out at a field that focuses on empire. And he says instead, right, instead of focusing on empire as the driving force, how can we focus on the way that people in Southeast Asia have navigated empire? How can we focus on individual agency instead? And then finally, right, he says to do this, we have to zoom in. Right? His big solution was to focus on the local. And so what I'm trying to do with this concept of Qhuab Ke's method is really to investigate how these first 2 points remain true today, but how this third point, I think, is no longer, right, the way towards a better historiography. So what is Qhuab Ke's method? Well, Qhuab Ke is a Hmong funerary practice, right? And I want to be clear here that I'm not coming to speak to you today as an expert on this cultural practice. I feel strongly, right, that although it is important to be informed, I will never be an expert on this, right? This is from a culture that is not my own. But what I think it does offer is significant lessons for how we see the world. So what is this practice? Well, it's translated as guiding the way. It's a practice that happens during a funeral, where the soul or the spirit of the deceased, right, you would say the plig in Hmong, is guided back home through all of the places they've lived during their life. And in retracing this journey, right, I think we see a framework that is now today inherently diasporic. inherently transnational, that subverts those boundaries and those borders I was talking about earlier, right? And so what actually happens? Well, I think the most important part of this framework, right, that I'm going to get to in my final conclusion is that, normally, if I were to retrace my life, right, I want you to all think about how you would retrace your life, right? The stops that would be important to you, all of the places you would call home, right? For me, I was born in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. And so when I think about my journey, that is where it ends, right? But that's not where the journey ends for Hmong in the diaspora who are practicing Qhuab Ke. Once they return to the place of their birth, they pick up, and they call it the golden cloak or the golden jacket. It's a placenta, and in Hmong tradition is buried under the house. And they're born, they put it back on, and then they continue their journey. And they continue to a place that we can think of as an imagined homeland. Right? Not territorialized, deterritorialized. A place where they rejoin their ancestors. Right? In a Hmong kingdom that may have not existed in life, but certainly can exist after death. And I think ultimately, right, we could see the critiques and the way that this is method, right, using this as a way to structure our historical inquiry would challenge some of these colonial foundations of the field. But I think that last part, right, that idea that you are returning to somewhere that is even in excess of how we imagine our lives and our life journeys, I think that is the most powerful part. And so we'll return to that at the very end. So what does this method actually do, right? How am I using this as a method to structure historiographical inquiry? Well, the first thing I should say is, I have this illustration, I did not make this, right? It is a sample illustration of what Qhuab Ke might look like, what a journey might look like, right? And I think what this goes to illustrate is the now inherently transnational, inherently diasporic element of this ritual now, right? You start in somewhere like Milwaukee, Manitowoc, St. Paul, you move across the United States, and you go all the way back to Thailand, and then even into Laos. So, how does this practice actually structure historiographical inquiry? Well, I see there are a couple of different ways it can do so. First, it allows for us to rethink the spatial and temporal boundaries of our historiographical projects, right? And this is where, by centering the lived experiences of one person, we move past those boundaries of the nation state, right? We move past the boundaries of regionalism, right? The idea of Southeast Asia as a boundary region versus North America or the United States as a boundary region, right? They take on much less meaning when you are focusing on the journey. But I think the other important part about this is the temporal aspect. Because this is also a ritual that moves us through time, moves us backwards, through all of the places, right, that someone once called home. And I think what that does for me is it really decenters this teleological component of what I would call imperial historiography that says, right, that because things played out a certain way, that was the way things had to be. Right, we see this sort of idea of impending doom, right? In the stories of Southeast Asian refugees, this idea that things could not have gone differently because they went in a certain way. And I think moving backwards inherently unsettles that. It draws our attention, not to this teleological idea of civilizational advancement and of moving forward, right? But to the inflection points, to the individual agency that occurs along someone's journey. Next, right, as one life path, it changes our scope of investigation. And I think one of the challenges with this framework, right, one of the things I'm still sorting out, is that this is ultimately an individual framing. So one of the questions I ask in my dissertation is, what would a collective Qhuab Ke entail? Is that even a framework that we should be interested in pursuing? But I think still that emphasis on the individual, right, as one person's life, as the center of our investigation does something important, right? It doesn't just change the parameters of our investigation, but I think it also recenters us on what's the most important part of the histories we are telling, which are, at the end of the day, the people involved, right? Next, as a journey, right? It helps us subvert these expected categories of regionalism and the nation state. And this is where I think it's not just that it's transnational, right? It's not just that this framing takes us from a place like Milwaukee to a place, right, like Bangui Nai. It's also that there's this movement inherent to it, right? We have to get comfortable with change, with moving through things. And I think that is something that historiography in general can struggle with. It's much easier to write a history of a single bounded place than it is to come with the complications of movement, of a journey. And then finally, right, it's a practice that is deeply embedded in specific cultural and historical context. And in doing so, right, it draws our attention to the continuities that exist over space and time. And I think most importantly for me, it shows how the violence of empire that exists in Southeast Asia continues to exist in the United States. Right, inherently connected. And in drawing those connections, I would argue, we inherently subvert the epistemological violence of empire. Now, I want to think through briefly, right? This is not an idea that I'm coming up with out of left field, right? And really, I think what I'm trying to do ultimately is to consider how myself, as a non-Hmong scholar looking at diasporic Hmong history, might be faithful to the way that Hmong Americans in particular in my project, right, understand their own past. So in doing so, I want to talk briefly with other scholars in the field and see where I fit in, right? Because I'm not just inspired, I'm not just coming to this place, but looking at the cultural practices of the Hmong diaspora, but I'm also looking at what others in the field are doing. And so what does this help us think through, right? What do I think Qhuab Ke's method really does? How is it in conversation with other scholars? Well, for all of you Southeast Asianists in the room, Dr. Mike, this is just for you. I think we start with this concept of the Zomia narrative, right? And this is the idea of how we talk about highland ethnic minorities in Southeast Asia. The most famous example, right, being James C. Scott's The Art of Not Being Governed, which tells a story, right, about highland people as one-dimensional, as trying to avoid state control, right? We have the quote, direct quote up here, right? The best that highlanders could do was to run away and hide in their abodes of egalitarianism and freedom. Right? And it's this idea, this story that we tell about a specific part of Southeast Asia that emphasizes not the individual agency, right? But rather a pre-created narrative. And it fits the critical complexities of experience into this one accepted story. And what is this story? It's the idea that for Southeast Asian highland minorities, they're stuck in the past. It's a teleological argument. It's a story that locates highland minorities as out of place and out of time, as disconnected, not just from the region as a whole, right, but also as disconnected from our contemporary world. And we see this, right, in the idea that when confronted with modernity, specifically in the form of national integration, they become something else. They cannot have an identity that is separate, right, when confronted with these forces, right? And so this is not my critique, right? This is a critique that I agree with wholeheartedly, but this is a critique that comes from Leif Johnson's Slow Anthropology, where he's looking at James C. Scott's work, and he's saying, hey, what is the problem with this narrative that he is presenting here, right? And what I want to argue is that actually Qhuab Ke's method helps us tell a different story than the Zomia narrative. It helps us reconfigure that Zomia narrative in Southeast Asia, but also, and it helps us combat the ways that the Zomia narrative has traveled with Hmong refugees to the United States. Next, right, one of the most exciting things in the field right now of Hmong studies is Ma Bang's History on the Run. And this is that idea of linkage, right? She says that Hmong, Americans specifically, but Hmong in the diaspora as well, have a historiographical approach. She names it History on the Run, that links the transition from overt colonial domination, the disruption of decolonization and the secret war, with a post-war period of ongoing circulation of knowledge through state, public, and refugee narratives, right? And so this is the idea, I think, to distill it down to its core, that the historiography of the Hmong diaspora subverts that epistemological violence of empire. That by linking together experiences of past and present, by linking together experiences in Southeast Asia with experiences in the diaspora, what you are doing, right, is telling a different story. And finally, this concept of refugee time or refugee temporalities that I take from Eric Tang's Unsettled, which is a book, right, that looks at the experiences of Cambodian refugees who live and work in the heart of New York City. And he says, right, in the same way, the refugees' knowledge that with each crossing, resettlement, and displacement, an old and familiar form of power is being reinscribed. And I think when I take History on the Run, and I take refugee time or refugee temporalities together, what I see is that Qhuab Ke's method points us in the direction of being able to see both of these things, right? For me, Qhuab Ke's method is an example of how we can be more specific within this overall structure of History on the Run. For me, Qhuab Ke's method is a way where we can use this concept of refugee time or refugee temporalities to write an anti-colonial history. So, what I want to do for the duration of our time together is to look at a relatively eclectic collection of examples where I see the use of this framework, right, trying to actually put it into practice. So one of the things, right, that I said that this framework does that's so important is that it fundamentally challenges this idea of boundaries, right, that separation that exists between Southeast Asia and the United States, or Southeast Asia and the rest of the diaspora. So these are pictures that I took of the Hmong and Lao Veterans Memorial in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, my beloved hometown. And I actually had the honor of, as a very young child, being there when this memorial first opened. Right, and so I want us to just briefly consider over here, I know it's probably pretty hard to read them, I'm going to read you the history, the story that the dedication of this memorial tells, right, the front of this memorial. It says, this memorial stands here, not to glorify war, but to clarify what happened because of the secret war waged by the United States and her allies in Laos. Its secrecy has prevented Americans from appreciating the service and sacrifices of the warriors and those who supported them. Sadly, their valor and loyalty are being forgotten, as their story has never been adequately told. Thus, the memorial stands in a community deeply and directly affected by the war's aftermath to tell how Americans and non-Americans worked together as allies to keep U.S. soldiers from dying in South Vietnam. There's more on that dedication, right? But I think, who is the main actor in this history? It's the United States. The secret war becomes a story of the United States fighting against the path of law, fighting against communism. And I don't know about all of you, but the last time I checked, there weren't exactly a ton of American soldiers fighting in the secret war. Even in the aftermath, right? How do we understand this history? They're painting this memorial as a way, not to commemorate Hmong sacrifice, right, but to educate Americans. Again, we see the same issue that they had in 1961. That even in a memorial that is supposedly to honor Hmong Americans, the West is the focus. In this case, America is the focus. But we have to look at the other panel, and this is where I think you see the power. This is where I think you can see how we understand a different story and recenter Hmong agency in a moment such as this, right? Let's start, right, with this panel right here. It's in recognition of Tubi Li Phong, right? One of the preeminent leaders of the Hmong community in Laos. And I think for me, what is so interesting about this panel is not what it says, right? Because really it just gives a brief biography of Tubi Li Phong, right? But rather, the languages in which it is written. So it's written in English, it's written in Hmong RPA, but it's also written in French. And it is the only aspect of the panel, of the entire memorial, to be written in French, right? Now, as somebody born and raised in Sheboygan, I can tell you, it is a German city. We have very little French influence in that immediate area, right? It is so German that for New Year's this year, we had brats as our celebratory dinner, right? The only way that we can understand, in my mind, the significance of that French language and what that does is by looking to Southeast Asia, is by taking on a framework that embraces the connections between a different region and a place as small as Sheboygan, Wisconsin. Because really what this French is a callback to French Empire. We know that Tubi Lifong and his family were close allies of the French and came to a position of power largely by cooperating with and working with and advocating for Hmong rights within the system of French colonialism, right? This is, I think, a callback to that, and it's a way of acknowledging, right, and forcing us to remember that these histories are interconnected. And in doing so, what does it do? Well, I think, right, one of the things it can do that is most powerful for us is it directly links together that history of high colonialism, of French Empire in Southeast Asia, with the violence of American militarism and American empire of the Secret War. This is a memorial to the Secret War with an inscription in French that takes on a coherent historical narrative, only when you look differently than the way we might traditionally look. Only if you use Qhuab Ke as your method of telling you how to consider this history. So, where else do we see this? Well, we have this inscription as well, right? And it's not written in French, but it says in loving memory, right, of Senator Mavu. And this one, right, was quite the challenge for young Alex just starting out learning about Hmong history, because I had searched and I had Googled and I looked at all these places and I didn't know that Wisconsin had had a state senator who was Hmong. I hadn't known that this individual had been a senator, right, at the state or at the national level. I said, why hasn't this history been told? But then I actually read, right? It's important to really read the inscription. And it celebrates the fact that he was a 2-term senator in Laos. And obviously that's a big accomplishment. We can understand why somebody would want to commemorate that, right? But if this memorial is really, as the first inscription says, to educate Americans about the Secret War, about the United States, I'm not so sure that that framing makes sense. And what I really like about this, right, is that the title, In Loving Memory of Senator Mavu, offers no explanation. Because for the people who created this panel, right, for the Hmong Americans themselves who put this together, no explanation was needed. It was already understood, right? And so for me, again, we see how focusing on Hmong understandings through Qhuab Ke's method, Hmong understandings of history, bridges these barriers. Now, you will notice there is a third picture up here. I have been talking too much, so we will skip that one. I promise you it does more of the same thing that I've been talking about. All right. So another way that this helps us understand this history, right, is to see where we can locate the United States in Southeast Asia, right? And so I turn now to something that's a little bit less concrete than a memorial, but to look at the paperwork that Hmong refugees were expected to sign before they were allowed to resettle in the United States. So you can see, right, 2 excerpts taken directly from the paperwork they were expected to sign, and then the map that they were given. You can see this little circle right here that tells them that they would be resettled in Wisconsin. And you know what I find to be ironic about that circle, of course, is that they circle damn near the entire state. So there's a question, right, of where would you actually go? What are they actually telling you? So what are these 2 aspects of this resettlement paper? What do they actually tell us, right? Well, one is the requirement of permanent residence, right, which is the status that Hmong refugees were given when they arrived in the United States, requiring all men and boys of a certain age to register for selective service. And although this is not the main core of my argument, I do just want to take a second for us to reflect on how difficult that is to process. Living in a refugee camp, right? 25% of Hmong men and boys, ages 14 and over, died during the Secret War. And in this paperwork, the United States is looking at them and saying that sacrifice was not enough. more is required. Secondly, we have this well-established concept of debt. The idea, and specifically in the document, they are signing a contract that agrees to repay the cost of their plane ticket from Thailand to the United States, bringing them in debt to the nation as they join, right? And I think, right, the important part of this for us is something other scholars have already established, right? This tells us a ton about the way that citizenship is racialized and the way, right, that Asian Americans are required to earn citizenship that is given to white Americans. And it tells us a lot about how U.S. empire functions, right? How it tries to create an investment in racialized capitalism and all of these other critiques, right? It does those things. I think those are very important. But what I'm interested in is how Qhuab Ke's method can help us think of this in a different way. How can we center Hmong agency here? How can we find agency in the moment of signing these forms? In the moment of agreeing to register for the draft? In the moment, right, of promising to repay a plane ticket? And for me, Qhuab Ke is this framework that centers the importance of movement and centers the importance of a journey, is how we do that. Because in a sense, this journey, agreeing to leave Southeast Asia, to go to the United States, is actually a radical act of resilience, of survivance. Taking on this obligation of debt, right? Yes, it is something that for us shows these structures of oppression, right? Racialized capitalism, but also, I think it's important for us to remember that there's a hope in that future too. That for Hmong American scientists, not only are they agreeing to repay this, but they are saying that we will survive and we will rebuild our lives enough to repay this debt. For me, I think there's something powerful in that, right? And I think the other thing that this does is it helps us locate United States empire, right? American empire in Southeast Asia, even in a refugee camp. Even in these places that are deemed to be temporary, right? And I think the act of having to agree, of having to make a conscious decision to enter this new context is really important for us to remember. That we see American empire, right? One of their main goals in the refugee camps is not just resettlement, right? But resettlement under these imperial auspices, right? Under these specific hierarchies of race, of capitalism, of all of these things. And to me, it's understanding that that starts, right? That is located in Thailand, where these forms are signed. Challenges how we understand U.S. history. Challenges where we see the boundaries of U.S. empire. Next. I want to think through a source that I found in the IHRC archives at the University of Minnesota. And I will apologize, right? Ideally, I would love to have a picture of this source, because what the source is a list of items, right? It is a social services document in which a Hmong refugee only recently arrived in the Twin Cities in August requests certain things to rebuild life in the United States. They say, what do you need to survive? What are you missing? And they give many of the traditional things we would expect as a part of Hmong culture. A baby carrier, a large pot, a Hmong knife, right? A hoe, all of these different things to rebuild life, right? But over the top, scrawled in a thick black Sharpie on this document, presumably the social services worker helping them had written a different list. Jackets, gloves, hats, scarves, everything you need to survive a Minnesota winter, right? And although August is nice and warm, we know what comes after. And I think what this shows us actually, right, is the way, first, that Hmong Americans attempted to rebuild life. And that's important on its own. But what I really think that this does is it helps us understand how the Zomia narrative is translated to the United States, right? So I want you to think about the way that Hmong Americans were talked about when they first arrived in the United States. Right? They were referred to as the least assimilable. Right? I have a quote that shows this, right? But rarely exposed to Western culture, hopelessly backwards, primitive, right? All of these horrible, horrible descriptions. And we see in those descriptions the exact same narrative we see in the stories we tell about Zomia. That idea of being out of place and out of time, about being unable to survive incorporation in the nation state. In this case, through refugee resettlement. And I think, right, we also see that in the actions of the social services worker, who proclaims that actually the refugees themselves don't know what they need to reconstruct life. That actually it is the jackets and the hats and all of these things that are more urgent than what the refugee themselves request. I think for me, we see the imposition of the same narratives over the top, right? And that is an important linkage because it shows how the epistemic violence of empire goes from one region to another. Now, the last thing I want to say on this idea here, right, is that I think the association of Hmong refugees in the United States rebuilding an element of traditional life is also a way for us to see Southeast Asia in the United States, right? I think oftentimes when we see the context of the Hmong diaspora, we think about a deterritorialized idea, diaspora that forgets that Southeast Asia is the point of origination for many of these refugees, right? And so for me, another way that we see this linkage, another way that Qhuab Ke helps us understand, is to think about what you would actually see if you were to literally walk back through this journey. And what you see in the United States, right, is in this garden, in this village created in Minnesota, are legitimate attempts of Hmong in the United States to rebuild Southeast Asia in certain ways. Right? To rebuild a scenery that is familiar, to rebuild concepts that are familiar. And I think what is important for us to do, what Qhuab Ke's method helps us to understand, is how to think about that and how to talk about that outside of the Zomia narrative. That Hmong Americans are not rebuilding some of these things, are not trying to reclaim a life that has been lost because they're primitive or incapable of assimilating to life in the United States, but rather because we can see the real sort of agency that comes with trying to reclaim something has been ripped away by the violence of empire. Now I have another example, and this I have to say, especially since I'm now also running out of time, is the most terrifying part of my presentation. Because I attempted to translate the lyrics of a song written in Hmong. And my beloved Hmong language professor, Sifu Chua, is sitting in the front row, and I know what her face looks like when I translate something wrong. And so I am very hopeful. I have tried very hard to ensure this is accurate. And I think this is the type of song, right? And I know for some of you, right, you might be thinking, a song, really? What sort of history is that, right? I think for me, it tells us everything. So first off, I want to just spend a second, right? This is a song, it's called the Mavu Remix. It's a YouTube special, right? It's published on YouTube, they're self-funding, but it's popular. It has almost 4.5 million views today. That's a song that fits in this genre of what we might call gangster rap, right? It's about things like selling drugs and gang violence and life in the streets, in this case, the streets of California, right? And it's written by this group, Sons of No Town, right, composed of 2 Hmong Americans, and then a third person is featured who is also Hmong American, right, as the producer. And I think, for me, this is a source that we would generally not look at in the academy. Because it's a hard source to come at, right? It talks about the sorts of topics we're not always comfortable discussing. But I think what we see here is an example of how Hmong Americans themselves link together that violence of empire, and in doing so, dispute narratives about Southeast Asian history, even in the United States, right? So the line that I am most interested here, right? You can read, this is just the first verse that I took out, right? The line I'm most interested in here is this line. We push drugs like GV power. So they're saying, right, they're claiming, hey, we sell drugs, we're engaging in this activity in the same way that General Vang Pao sold opium, sold heroin back in Southeast Asia during the Secret War. They're explicitly making that connection. And I want us to think for a second, right? What is the narrative that is told about Hmong Americans and about Hmong in Southeast Asia in relationship to drugs? Well, in the United States, we know that it's this racialized idea in places like Wausau, in places like my hometown, where Hmong Americans are associated with gang activity and with bringing in the drug trade to areas that previously didn't have that. But in Southeast Asia, the history of the relationship between the Hmong and opium goes much deeper. And we know the history, right? So, just briefly, during the French Empire, right? During the high colonial period, Hmong opium production, which had always been a minor part of Hmong agricultural production in the highlands, right? Because the highlands are specifically suited to growing this plant, right? Opium production was heavily incentivized by the French Empire because they knew that they could sell it for intense profits. They incentivized it. They said you can now pay your taxes in opium. And in doing so, they kicked into overdrive this association of the Hmong with this drug. And then the Secret War. The CIA fighting an illegal war without the knowledge, without the funding of the majority of their country. They bring in Air America, a presumably private airline, and they encourage the Hmong to continue growing this drug. And they traffic it to refineries around the world and use that money to continue to fund not just the Secret War, right, but wars across the globe. And in the aftermath of the Secret War, that association stuck, right? There was a controversy here about naming an elementary school after General Vang Pao, in which, right, one of the main reasons not to do it, against his legacy, was this association of him as a drug lord, of selling opium. And my goal here, really, truly, is not to debate the legacy of General Vang Pao, but rather to think through what it means that in this song, these rappers are reclaiming this history, right, this association that has always been filled with a negative moral judgment, right? When they say that Hmong Americans and that Hmong in Southeast Asia are affiliated with opium, they say it as a mark of immorality. They say it as a way to critique the Hmong as a people, as backwards and immoral. Think about how this song inverts it. It reclaims, right, in proudly saying that we push drugs like General Vang Pao, it reclaims that history. It says, yes, this history did happen, but why did it happen? If you look, right, at the rest of the lyrics of the song, I have one specific example right here. They say, the righteous man walks the crooked path. The righteous man is forced to do things he might not otherwise want to do to survive. These narratives we tell ourselves about the drug trade are inverted. And the focus is not on the drugs as an act of immorality, right, or the trafficking of opium as some mark, right, of some sort of backwardness, but rather as a method of survival, as what is required for a people confronted with the violence of empire, first with the French, and then with the United States in Southeast Asia under the Secret War, and then again in the United States, in the inner cities of California. They're drawing a connection with these lyrics, I think, that we concede to taking a different approach. They are reclaiming this history, this association of drugs with the Hmong in a way that I think is extremely powerful and in a way that directly speaks back to the epistemic violence of empire. The final part I want to say about this song is the final line, right? It's this idea that their goal, And this is where I think is more evidence. But because we know that there is gangster rap and other songs in this genre where people talk about selling drugs for reasons we might criticize. For personal gain, for money, for fame, for all of these things, right? It is something that is considered to be cool. But just to emphasize that that's not what's going on here, right? That what this song is doing is something inherently different. I want you to look at this final line, right? Repeat it over in the chorus. It says, I'll be sitting on a mountain, reflecting on my life, right? My life is over. And I'll look out and I will say, well, at least I fattened my herd. At least I continued to provide for my people. And that to me is the act of reclamation. That to me draws that parallel between Vang Pao agreeing to engage in the drug trade, to try and provide for his people, and the same thing that we see among Americans in the inner city of California. So, skipping over just a little bit, let's wrap up, right? Let's bring it back to my overall point here today. As an area of studies discipline, Southeast Asian studies and Southeast Asian history is a part of that discipline. Must wrestle with the colonial history of the field, right? We are not struggling with a different legacy than what they were struggling with in 1961, but we are continuing to struggle with the exact same thing. Empire persists as a thorn in our side. In this case, a question, right? Whether we phrase it as an autonomous history, whether we phrase it as looking for agency or some other method, right? That is still our goal. That is the way we can respond to the epistemic violence of empire. And if we look back, right, at Smail's recommendations of how we get to that point, he says, we have to move away from the false binaries of East versus West. We have to emphasize the internal agency of Southeast Asians themselves, and we have to zoom in to local and regional histories, right? I think the first 2 points we can see through using Qhuab Ke as a framework. Qhuab Ke accomplishes that inherently, right? It's a diasporic framework. It moves away from those false binaries, right? We can see Southeast Asia in the United States and the United States in Southeast Asia. It emphasizes internal history, right? We see an emphasis on the individual lives themselves, right? Qhuab Ke is ultimately this framing of refugee life forms. And in doing so, right? In doing so, it doesn't zoom us in. It does the opposite. It zooms us out. It breaks those barriers and those boundaries, right? Qhuab Ke helps us answer the call that was made in 1961 to have a more autonomous history by tracing refugee life forms. Not a region, not a country, not a nation state, but the life of the historical actors themselves as our boundaries. And secondly, right, through an emphasis on a culturally specific epistemological and historiographical practice, we're able to make sense of the world in a different way. We're able to understand why a rapper would proudly say that they sell drugs like General Vang Pao. Why it would be important for the ancestors of for the descendants of Tu Bi Li Fong to write about their ancestors in French, even in a city where the language is not spoken. I think ultimately, right, for me, reframing our understanding of Southeast Asian history, of Hmong diasporic history, of American history, through Qhuab Ke, through this method that tells us where to look and how to look. It helps us do more faithfully the ultimate, the highest calling of historiography, which is to bear witness to the lives these individuals have lived. For me, the purpose of history is to bear witness to the violence of empire, to bear witness to the resilience and the survivance of those who have navigated through its many different currents. And in doing so, Qhuab Ke's method, I think, becomes a radical act of resistance to the epistemological violence of empire, and lets us bear witness faithfully. For me, that's how we get to an autonomous history of Southeast Asia. Thank you.